Before we get going, just to yourselves externally, we've got about 50 people in the room. We're expecting about 400 externally, and we're going to bring you together through the magic that is Mentimeter. And with that, we'll actually move to start the presentation. So thank you very much. Hope you enjoy yourselves. I'm going to hand back to Ian to tell us a little bit more about Bentley Systems. Ian.
Okay, so as I say, welcome to the Digital Advancement Academy. For around about the last 6 years in here, we have been part of the Crossrail project, helping to educate a lot of their supply chain, their contractors, and also a lot of their teams. And it's always been about trying to change the culture within that environment. We know, and I'm sure you know very well also, that my industry, construction, is quite risk averse, it's quite slow at change, it's quite conservative, and when new big changes come along, such as the government's digital construction strategy and also the BIM mandate, etc., as they come along, it's a real big problem to change. And so the Academy here was set up to really try to get behind people and get them to understand, firstly, what the big vision is, secondly, where they fit into that bigger vision, thirdly, what's in it for them, because nobody likes to do anything unless there's a positive benefit for them, and then finally to take them through step by step of how to apply new standards, how to do new technologies, new methodologies, processes, and to eventually deliver that world-class standard. So it was all about bringing lots of people in and making sure that we could deliver a program of works, which was 220 odd different contracts, and they all interfaced and coordinated with each other. So as well as Crossrail, since 2014, we've been delivering the government BIM standards in here, whether that's looking at the 1192 suite of documents, the collaboration standards, whether that's the classification systems, and giving good advice out to not only UK companies of how to deal with that, but also worldwide. So we've had about 6,000 people come through these doors from about 50 different countries. A lot of our work now comes around from the Middle East and the Far East, who are really interested about what the UK are doing and how we are doing it, because they see us as world leaders in the digital transformation of our industry, which is very, very good indeed. So most of those have been government organisations, major projects and contractors, but we've had people all across the supply chain to come in and do things. And the resource is here for free. Okay, it doesn't cost anybody apart from my boss, Greg Bentley, who's now gone back out again. It costs him some, but it doesn't cost anybody else anything. So the point is, it's a free, neutral environment that just passes on good practice to the rest of the world. And with that, I'm going to hand you back over to Merv.
Thanks ever so much, Ian. And these are absolutely fantastic facilities. So what we're going to do now is flick back to menti.com, get your first vote. So there we are. We want to know what sector you work in. We want to know a bit about our audience. So if you can tell us from the 5 options that you've got there, I'll just run through them so everyone can see. It's government, department or arm's length body, private sector, not-for-profit sector, or in the private sector working with government department or arm's length body, or none of the above. So just so you're aware, we've got about 350 people externally on the call, which is fantastic. I think our record for Mentimeter response is about 200, so we're hoping to break that today and get a good sense of what sector you're working in. I can see that things are on the go slow here, I think because so many people are voting, but we should get some percentages later on. A good number of you voting, significant number of our audience, the highest percentages coming in there as working in a government department or ALB, or in the private sector working with a government department. So we'll leave that to take its course. We will advance to other Menti slides as we go through, so please keep your browser open. And with that, Jay, if I hand on to you to introduce the speakers.
Great, thank you, Merv, and that's really interesting, and thank you for those online for participating. Before we get into the introductions, I firstly wanted to say thank you to APM and obviously to Ian and Bentley Systems for this great facility, so appreciate it. And also to everyone online, thank you for your involvement and for logging into the webinar today. So introductions, I wanted to start off with Tony Meggs, who's joined us. Tony is the Chief Executive of the Infrastructure and Projects Authority, and previous to that, the Major Projects Authority. So he has a distinguished background in oil and gas as a senior executive, and with BP. Within BP, he set up the Project Leadership Program, which was the inspiration for the UK government's Major Projects Leadership Academy, and which is also known as the MPLA, of which Fiona is a graduate in 2014. And Fiona has been with the Home Office and has held several roles. Since 2014, Fiona has been the Chief Portfolio Officer, but in her time at the Home Office has held several roles covering departmental transformation, major projects in technology and shared services. I wanted to introduce Robert Buttrick, who is, I think it's fair to say, a standards expert. So Robert has been heavily involved with the British Standards Institute, has been heavily involved in helping to author Prince 2, and is also an independent author and has his own book out called Project Workout. And myself, I'm Grygoruk. I'm the Project Delivery Standards Lead. I work within the IPA and joined the civil service last year. Previous to that, I was consulting in the US, and I also have a master's in major program management from Oxford University. What we wanted to cover just briefly before we get to Tony is what you'll be hearing about in terms of the themes and the topics from the webinar today. Firstly, what is the Project Delivery Standard? We'll be covering that off in how it was conceived and the development of it. Why does government need a standard? We'll be covering from a governmental perspective, the benefits that we perceive from the introduction of the standard into government and departments. Importantly, who should use the standard? And also Fiona will cover off the usage of the standard in the Home Office. And key themes that you'll hear about throughout the webinar will be leading practice, which is what the standard brings to government, which in addition to capability and assurance, helps government achieve its vision of a world-class project delivery. So on that note, I'll hand over to Tony.
Thank you for coming today. So all I'm going to do, because I'm surrounded by experts, is provide a brief bit of context for standards. We are part of a movement in government led by the the Civil Service Chief Executive Officer, John Manzoni, which is to introduce and develop functional capability across government. So we have a number of functions such as HR, such as project delivery, such as commercial, such as financial, etc. And these are horizontal axes that work across the whole of government, designed to really improve the way that government delivers its business, strengthening professional capability, setting standards, etc. So this diagram here actually describes the major roles of not just the project delivery function, really, but all functions. This is the standard model. So we set strategic targets for what we want to do, for example, in project delivery, how we want to improve that over time. Very, very focused, all function on developing capability, professionalizing the civil service and making, improving our overall abilities to deliver, give expert advice, we drive continuous improvement. And then one very important component of this model is what we're talking about today, which is to create standards across government that, set a benchmark really, and my colleagues will describe this better than I, but basically to spread best practice, to illustrate and explain not exactly, but at a high level, how we want projects, programs and portfolios to be run. So our standards, actually, I believe we're the first ones to publish, but we are part of an interconnected web of different functions that are all developing in a common format, developed by my friend Robert, in a common format, a set of standards that will be used to continuously improve along all of these different functional. So how to think about a standard? And again, the expert will give the correct answers. But when I think about it, I think of them, they are reference documents. So a standard lays out quite explicitly those things that are required when you are undertaking a project in government, and also when you're undertaking a program, and also when you're setting up a portfolio management system, which is really a business process to manage a large group of projects and programs. So it's a standard is not something that you're going to read every day on the way to work. Sorry, Robert, but you're not. But it's like, you know, the standards that exist. Somewhere in Paris, there's a meter. And you don't have to carry the meter with you everywhere you go. It translates into, you know, tape measures and other forms of guidance that you can carry about your person. So you should think of the standard as the sort of the core definition of what we expect, and also some best practice, some shoulds as well as shalls. The language is very precise. But it underpins a lot of other activities. It underpins assurance activity. You assure against the standard. It underpins a lot of guidance. It underpins training. So it is the standard. It is the bedrock from which the whole system of project delivery across government is formulated. It is a sort of North Star which aligns all of our other products and activities. It's been developed by government, by experts from across government, and also drawing on a wide body of external materials. So it is sort of the best of the best, but it is tailored to some extent to work well in the government context. As I say, the language is quite precise. It, you know, defines that which is absolutely essential, must be done, and then other things that should or may be done, depending on your level of maturity and experience. What it is, it therefore is an enabler for people across government, and one must think about it like that rather than a straitjacket. It is to help people running projects or overseeing projects. It's of people at all levels of an organization. And in many ways, it can help projects get the resources and the structures and the governance they need to be effective, because this prescribes what the government expects. So I think of it not as a straitjacket, not as a kind of constraint on what you do, but rather as an empowerment. I think another thing to say, just a couple more things. You know, it's methodology neutral. We don't get into arguments here about, you know, agile versus waterfall or anything like that. It sits over that, and it can be used with different detailed methodologies. So it's a high-level architecture inside which different methodologies can be used. We think it helps to set projects up right, to create an integrated approach with the other functions, as shown in that standards diagram, identify capability gaps, etc., etc. And the last thing I just want to stress is that it is, we call it the project delivery standard. It is very important. It's about projects, programs, and portfolios. And the management of the portfolio of projects and programs is increasingly important in government, because we are doing too much, trying to do too much with too limited resources. And good portfolio management is absolutely critical, making sure that we, you know, we get the most bang for our buck. Yeah. So really, that's all I had to say.
Okay, thanks so much, Tony. We're going to go back to the Mentimeter and ask a couple more questions of our audience. So there you can see the results that came in for our first question, and 239 votes, which is fantastic. So what we want to know here is a little bit more about what term describes the main focus of your organization. And as we could almost do a wager, but I'm interested to see on previous ones, construction and engineering have come out strong. Those of you who are voting, you've seen the kind of suggestion graph, just one-word answers. And clearly this standard is across government, all government departments. So no doubt they're waiting with bated breath to see what comes through. and I guess the audience is drawn more widely than APM, but we've got a lot of APM representation in the room, members of our 15 different specific interest groups, and I know a lot of you are outside representing those different groups. So, okay, it is a record in terms of the number of responses, and you can see for yourself what's coming through. Let's say construction, engineering, but government, you might have expected. And here, this is a revisit to the project delivery capability framework. And those of you that are familiar with the framework will know there are 19 different roles, but they are organized into 3 different areas. So you've got project leadership, and we've heard about the Leadership Academy for major projects. You've got project delivery specialists, which are the probably the rump of the roles within that, and then business analysis and change specialists. As a benefits manager, one of my favorites, but typically we don't get the same sort of numbers in there. So we can see a good number of you are delivery specialists, and it's actually heartening to see some students on there as well. So keep sending your results in on this. And here we actually are focused now more on the standards themselves. So we want to know if your organization applies a standard for project delivery currently. And you will see the different categories there that have been suggested by Jay, that we've been working on this. Yes, and it's widely applied and adopted. Yes, but it isn't really followed. Yes, but we have multiple standards and guidelines, not one single standard. And no, our project standards determined by the project managers, or you know, I guess the response there in terms of no, I'm not aware of any standard in my organization. Looks like we're on the go slow here. I think that's because the number of results come in. That's our little dots moving from left across the screen, but you can see percentage wise that I think rather heartening, Robert. I don't know if you'd expected that, but yes, and it is widely applied. So, but obviously some work to do. So what we'll do, we'll flick back across to the presentation, and Jay, I think it's back to you.
Great, thank you, Merv, and that's really interesting results. So thank you everyone online for participating in that. It seems like we have a pretty good distribution of participants across different sectors, and also from that last question, it was great to see what the variance is on how project delivery standards may or may not necessarily be adopted within organizations. And picking up on some of those points, I'll be covering off on the next slide, overarching aims were and how the project delivery standard came to be. So initially, the project delivery standard, it had 6 key principles that were required and built as a foundation that we wanted to make sure it was, number 1, written by government for government. And I know that Fiona, you were involved in the initial development along with other working groups within departments around government. Can you give a bit of an overview about how your involvement was in place there?
Well, the Home Office was really enthusiastic about the development of the standard. In fact, you know, I was a very vociferous champion of actually getting to a standard and developing it, because we felt it was something that really mattered to us for a whole range of reasons that I'll come on to later. But so we engaged enthusiastically and vociferously, and one of the things I'm really pleased about is that we took quite a lot of care to involve not just the central team, but people who were actually doing projects and programs out in the business. So we got their involvement and engagement, because the thing that really mattered to us is it needed to be real and it needed to be useful to project practitioners. So yes, we were very closely involved all the way through.
Great, thank you. Secondly, you know, one of the main aims for the standard is not to define how you need to deliver your projects, but the focus is on defining what you need to do and why you need to do it. As Tony mentioned, there's lots of different ways that you can deliver projects. This standard really is your North Star. So as you begin your journey to deliver a project, you look to your North Star, and how you travel, or that mode of travel, can be lots of different ways. But as long as you have that North Star to reference that you're going in the right direction, that is the purpose of the standard. Thirdly, it is a part of a functional suite. As we had seen from that jigsaw puzzle overview diagram, that this slots in to how government is operating in the future. And ultimately, we are looking for the functional standards to stand by themselves, but collectively, they will really add the most value and define the operating model for government. Fourthly, as we had mentioned, UK government is focused on world-class project delivery. And that's why we are incorporating and have involved experts and have reached out to people within government to make sure that we have those project delivery leading practices incorporated into the standard. Fifth, it aligns the competencies. So as Merv had mentioned, the project delivery capability framework is great in defining what the roles are that should be involved in projects, programs, and portfolios. So we align the standard to those roles. So we've got great integration and consistency. And also the assurance that the standard provides is not only assurance that it empowers people that they know that they're following the right and leading practices for project delivery in government, but also for stakeholders. If people know that the project delivery standard is being applied and followed, then it gives them assurance as well. And then lastly, which Robert will speak against later, we have project delivery principles, which really are the core on what should be at the forefront for project delivery professionals when they use the standard. Robert, I'll pass over to you, but maybe you can just give a bit of a overview about what is the standard at its core.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I started this work in 2017, there's Pat in the front row here. He was on the working group, so great to see you here. Because it was a joint effort. I was the lead and community as I was told. So the whole question was, what is the standard? So we had that question there, how many people are using standards? And I bet many of the people answering that were thinking, what do you mean by standard? Because when we looked actually what was going on, we found some people said, oh, here's a standard. It was something like a green book or whatever, some huge manuals. And others, their standard was 8 or 9 statements on half a sheet of paper. Well, clearly neither were where we wanted. So we decided to take the course where the word standards using international standards, British standards. Many of the people use those as part of the specialist work they do. So we just adopted a lot of that in terms of using the terminology to get that precision. May means give approval, might means a possibility. You shouldn't see the word will. I bet some have slipped through editing. You shouldn't see it because none of us are clairvoyant. Yeah. So that's the precision of the language. Shall is something, you know, get on with, and should. Recommendation, but if your boss tells you, I think you should do that, it's damn near an instruction. You have a reason why not, or it's totally inappropriate. So there's the precision of the language. So we honed in on the form that you see in the current standard, and most of you in the room have got copies available to you here, and those online will be shown at the end how to get hold of one. So it's structured that because of the suite, and it's going right from permanent secretary downwards, or chief executives of arm's length bodies, you know, all these other bits and pieces that bolt onto government. They have the same pattern. They know where to look because it's a reference document, as Tony said. And so it starts off with what's the scope of it? Does it apply to me? And then it goes into the principles. I'll talk about some of those on the next slide. And then it talks about what portfolio, program, and project are. Now, if you don't know what a project and portfolio and a program are, the rest of the standard doesn't make any sense, or it might not. And of course, we've all got different views on what those are. And if we look through the different publications out there, they're all subtly different. So the point is, we've decided to standardize on what they are, mostly bringing on some of the international standard stuff that's come through, very flexible. And so that sets that frame, because it isn't as though our words are right and yours are wrong. It's just differently right versus this is how we're using it here. And we have to define that, but we've got to use it consistently. If we're going across government, consistent language means it's easy to communicate. So that's the sort of structure in terms of the language. Then we come down to the next section is always it's governance usually, because that section is about what's the most important thing. You want to make the seniors management go pale. You just mentioned things like governance. Pricks their ears up. How on earth do we know this organisation, whether it's a program, project, portfolio, whatever, is doing what we want it to? Because we can't do it all ourselves. So assurance is part of that. Decision making is part of that. Have a defined approach. As Tony says, the standard only says about the why and the what, not the how. So the how is pretty open. It's got suggestions because the government did the Prince 2 MSP and all that suite. Those are primary references, but tailoring is the message. It has to be appropriately proportionate to what you're doing. And then it goes into life cycles and then the different practices. And you'll notice some differences in the standard and maybe what you're used to in looking at other similar types of documents or methods. It's got quality is slightly differently approached in there, and there's probably some topics in there. You think, why is it there? You know, training. Well, if we don't have skilled, competent people, no matter how good our methods, standards, or whatever, we won't get done properly. So that's where we link back to the capability framework. But the standards, so based on that, what it's not a primer. It's not a Janet and John easy to read book about, you know, that you give to people to learn about how to be a project manager, program manager, or whatever. It's not a manual, it's not a handbook, and it's definitely not a guide or a methodology. But what it does do is it sets out the things that you would expect to see happening on any portfolio, program, or project. Explains why each is there. Because if you understand why something's there, it puts your brain in the right place. You're starting to look at things from the right perspective. And then it tells you what you expect to find. So, for instance, if I'm working in an agile team, having my risks up on a visibility board, nothing, absolutely adequate, fine. Keeping a look at them on our daily stand-ups, etc., absolutely fine. But if I'm running HS2, having them on a whiteboard in some room somewhere in head office is not a very bright idea. You need a much more structured, maybe process-driven way of handling all this stuff. So both of those approaches can comply with the standard. They say it's based on lots of good practice that's all around, taking the best of. None of them actually cover all of what the project delivery standard covers. So it is probably the most holistic that you'll find things out there. So let's have a look at some of the principles. Principles, nice, some of these. The idea of the principles is it's where your head should be. If there's no rules, no guidance in further down or whatever, this is what you should be thinking of. So I'll just pick out a few of those, like alignment to strategy. In other words, everything we're doing in government, for government, should be aligned to government policy or to the department objectives. If it's not, why are you doing it? It applies to any organisation, I would hope. It's the continuing justification. The world does change around us. Some of our things we do take rather a long time, and the world moves on sometimes rather faster than we can do them. So to continually justify, is it still needed? Is it still in the form that's needed? It's absolutely vital. Let's look at proportionate. If your project is only that big, like a foot long, as opposed to half a mile long, the standard still applies. But how you apply it will be quite different. So the management has to be appropriate and proportionate. Proportionate, because you don't want to put in, it's not about building bureaucracy. If you think something's bureaucratic, you probably, if you're the one leading it, build the bureaucracy in yourself. Some people use it as a sort of crutch, because they're not willing to look at the risks, recognize the risks, or recognize how they can deal with things. So appropriate and proportionate, that means about scaling and tailoring. And sometimes appropriate means we don't always have the best people available. We don't always have the right people. Because although up here we have to have skilled and competent teams, if we haven't got quite that, because it's the real world, isn't it? Then of course your appropriate has to be, you put across your methods such that they can understand them. And you put the support in to help them over the gaps that they're not. So you can see how this thing sort of works with these principles. Another one that I'll highlight here is outcomes. It's funny, you sometimes get this argument, projects do deliverables and programs do outcomes and benefits. Working with the government is the only place I had no trouble saying, surely outcomes is all, outcomes, that's what we need, projects and outcomes.
Absolutely right. They all said in the working group, didn't they, Pat? The arguments I have in some private sector organisation or international standards meetings. And it's all about social change. It's all about economic benefit, whatever the government's agenda is. And that's what focus is. And that changes your viewpoint on what the scope of the project is. We've got someone here from Project X, I noticed earlier. And on one of those meetings, they were talking about case studies where the operating manuals for a water treatment plant didn't exist. So the guys who were operating the plant didn't actually know how to do it. You know, with these principles, the outcome is what you aim for, and the scope that has to happen goes in there, comes right back from that benefits mapping type of stuff. So that's another aspect of the principles, how they apply throughout the life cycle.
Great, thank you. So as you can see, those principles were really key to how we use those to make sure that those delivering projects have it at the forefront of their mind. So what I'm going to cover here is, what is the value of the standard? So we're doing this obviously for a reason. What do we think those reasons are? Well, firstly, we're looking at the three areas around capability assurance and having a standard. And really the standard should be one of the very first steps that you open up the standard and reference, or at least know that you have referenced it previously when you're delivering projects in the UK government. It helps to identify and tailor, as Robert had mentioned, the approach and methodologies. It helps to identify and align the capabilities for team roles. As Tony mentioned, we really see this as an enabler to have conversations with your line managers about ensuring you have the right people, you have the right skills at the right time. And that's what really what we're aiming to achieve with the standard. It's used as a reference for project assurance, as I mentioned before, and it also provides a consistent and fit for purpose project delivery approach across government. So if you're in the Home Office, if you're in Department for Transport, if you're in DWP, then we are all starting to talk the same language in project delivery across government. And that necessarily isn't the case at the moment. And that's what we're trying to bring everyone together on the same page. Just exploring this a little bit more around the alignment of maturity models, competencies, and learning. Again, the project delivery standard can help with understanding the organizational capabilities and the maturity levels. So once they start to embed and adopt this, then they can use this as a reference to make improvements within the organization to increase their maturity levels of project management practices. At the individual level, we mentioned that the standard highlights the key roles that are expected in delivery of projects. Combined with the reference back to the PDCF, then it gives you a very powerful tool to be able to link back to what the competencies are that people should have, and then also the learning and development that they may need to provide some further development. And also one of the other things is sometimes in projects, there are people that have lots of scars and lots of experience. And that's not necessarily something that you can teach, but if you know that you need a project director with a lot of experience, then it's just some explicit knowledge that will help to tease that out about what type of people you need on that project as well. Who should use the standard? So it's been very cognizant that when we delivered the standard, we wanted to make sure that it was available and accessible and applicable to everyone in government at all different levels. And I might get maybe Tony or Fiona to talk about some of these. So Tony, from a PermSec or DG level, how have you seen them having awareness of the standard, and how do you see them integrating the standard into the work that they do?
Permanent secretaries are not going to sit around and read these standards from cover to cover. So the role, you know, from a permanent secretary perspective, it is about their ability to understand what is going on in their organisation, get assurance that these standards are being applied, or you know, whether there are any significant gaps between what those expectations and the reality in the day. So, you know, as part of a management system, There are things that are important to permanent secretaries. Some may read them, but I think just knowing they're there and knowing that there is some thing against which the department's capabilities and performance can be measured is the critical thing.
Great. And Fiona, as a head of profession for the Home Office, how do you see this helping you as part of that role?
So I think, as I said, I think we regard this as really valuable. As a head of profession, I'm very often asked, so, what is the standard we should be applying? How does this work? What does that mean? How does that work within this framework? What should I be doing? And that question can range from, new SROs or program directors through to, if you like, audit and assurance, who will say, yeah, that's great, we're going to audit this thing, but we don't quite know what kind of project it is what should we look at? And the problem is if you have lots of different reference sources, then as head of profession, I'd be saying, don't look at that one, but that's not the only one. You may find that's more appropriate. That's not great. So having something that is a definitive reference guide where we say in government, because there are certain things about government that are particularly relevant to the way you do things, you need to think about this is how we do it. These are the standards. Here it is just hugely enabling. And it's only a starting point for a whole range of other things that we want to do.
Great, thank you. And going back to some of the Mentimeter results previously, we saw that there was a good portion of people online who were project delivery professionals. And so how that relates to the work that you do, then as part of your portfolio program and project officers, or individual program managers or project managers, then this is a great reference to use as an enabler, as I mentioned before. That's one of the key aspects that we're looking for departments to embed and for adoption within departments so that we can make sure that we have this tool driving those conversations. And lastly, as Ian had mentioned right at the start, dealing with government can sometimes be quite confusing. You're never quite sure who you need to go to or what the expectations are from a project standpoint. So this should give external suppliers and those interacting with government a great insight about what they need to do to make sure that there's alignment on either bidding for work or current work that they're involved with, so that there's no misalignment between what the expectations are outside of government and expectations are inside of government. So on that point, I think we've got another Menti question coming up. So I'll hand you over to Merv.
We've got the results there of our previous one. 300 of you voted. So here's an open question. What may be some of the challenges of adopting the project delivery standard? So we don't imagine it's plain sailing. And as project delivery professionals, I'm sure you can come up with something. I think you can send in one or more results, and these will begin to scroll through as they come in. So, and this is going to be a useful set of data for Jay and his colleagues to trawl through to see how they might actually knock down some of these challenges. So you can see we've already got 67 of you voting. There's people voting within or submitting answers within the room as well as externally. Thank you for that. If you want to comment on any that come in, then please do. And by the way, we will make available to you all this information afterwards. You simply need to put your email address in, and you'll be able to look through it as well. So significant number of challenges come in. I've seen quite a lot about culture and communication, but there may be some that are more surprising in there. So thank you very much for that data.
So, as head of profession, but also as somebody who's delivered a lot of programs and projects within government, project delivery can quite often feel like a maze, particularly when you're in the thick of it. And to some extent, with the methodologies have developed over the last few years with more agile and different kinds of agile and approaches, I think that's become more so. And therefore, one of the things that I think the standard is really useful as me is it's not necessarily the way through the maze, because we all need to find our way through the maze to some extent, but at least it gives us as a picture. It shows us the layout, because you'll know if you're in a maze, it's very hard to see what's going on. Step back, or you see a plan, or you have an aerial photograph. Actually, it's quite often a lot simpler than you think, or that it feels, simply because you can see how it works. And to some extent, for me, the kind of real value of the standard is in putting all those building blocks together and saying, this is how it works. So, that I think is kind of the way I think about the standard. It's not a guide, it's not a how-to, it's just showing you how it works in fairly simple. So, how are we applying the standard in the Home Office? Well, three big things really we're focusing on, three real benefits to this. So the first thing, and the reason why I really, really wanted us to get to a government standard in the first place, is one source of what it is, project delivery. A definitive reference for project delivery in the Home Office and across government. And that's really helpful for a number of reasons. One is there are just lots of different terms and languages and references and assumptions out there about what project portfolio, program, project delivery is. So having one place where the terms are written down and we say, in government, in the Home Office, this is what we're referring to, this is what we mean, this is the term we're using, it's really helpful. And there is, at the end of the day, no right answer about what one of these things is. You can have an endless and very lengthy debate about whether you call it an SRO or a sponsor, or the difference between a project or a program. To some extent, it's just right. Let's all use a common set of language around this, and it will help us all move through that. So, just really useful as a consistent source of language for us all. But also, in doing so, it just cuts through so much stuff and noise. So it's a real aid for us in terms of simplifying the landscape. And one of the things that colleagues will know I was really keen to make sure was that the standard was written in very clean, clear, simple terms that everybody could understand. Because for me, this is about taking the mystique and the kind of the endless terminology out of it and turning it into something that everybody can understand what it is. So that's one thing. The second thing is it is a really important part for us of our assurance. And one of the things I'm really pleased to say is, the Home Office has developed a new assurance framework over the last year. And this is absolutely embedded lockstep into it. So when you look at how do we do project delivery in the Home Office, what is our standard for assurance in the Home Office, project delivery, it's this. And you can click through into this. So it's absolutely embedded as part of our assurance framework. And that's great, not only for people doing projects, but also for people who are doing the assurance, because it tells them what to expect and gives us all a kind of consistent yardstick or meter for how we're doing against it. So, that is something that it's a real benefit to us, and we will continue to kind of develop it as part of that. And then finally, and most importantly, it's all about improvement. So I oversee the Home Office portfolio. We have lots of programs that deliver really well. We have some that aren't always quite so good. But we are using the standard to help us be clear about, if you like, hygiene factors. In any program, this is what you should have. These are the basics. This is a checklist. These are the things you need to understand. And also, and this is where we're kind of developing it beyond that, and there are some colleagues in the room who've been closely involved in this very enthusiastically. We're then taking it to the next level and starting to look at the kind of, so what does this mean in terms of how we manage these things in the Home Office? What's our life cycle? What are the approval points? What are the points at which certain things need to happen? And in fact, some colleagues are developing, in the process of developing, a really great tool which takes us to the next level and says, in the Home Office, this is what we do when, this is where this body gets involved, this is when that assurance needs to happen. And by the way, if you're doing an agile project, it works like this, because a lot of our stuff is agile. And if you're doing a waterfall type project, it works like this. But by the way, these things are the same. And if you're doing a program, whether it's one, the other, or both, and many of them are both, then this is how it works, and this is how it links to the portfolio. So that is something that, you know, of itself, it won't deliver projects, but it will help us in making sure we set things up right, we plan for them right, and then we have the right sort of checkpoints along the way to make sure we understand how they're delivered and then deliver. And then finally, and I'm also really pleased about this because this is the other thing I cared a lot about over the last couple of years. The other big thing that has been developed by the project delivery profession in government has been the project delivery capability framework, which again, for the first time, sets out a consistent definition of the different roles that there are in project delivery, and really brilliantly, I think, what those mean in terms of what the roles are, where, who can do them, what kind of experience you need, what standards are expected, what kind of development people need. It's really, really good. And you know, that is part of us developing a much more strategic approach to developing professionalism in project delivery with clear career pathways for people, linked to competencies, linked to development. So a much clearer offer for how we build project delivery professionals. And the project delivery standard then docks brilliantly onto that. So in terms of the standard, you know, what are the kind of roles you need in a project? Why? Because it links into the why. And then, you know, what do people need to do? Why does that matter? And when are they needed at different points in the life cycle? And that, you know, is those two documents together, locked together in a way that gives us, I think, a really strong framework for improving project delivery in terms of what we do, how and who does it.
Great, thank you. And I think Fiona's mentioned the great work that's going on at the Home Office. And I know that there's lots of representatives from other departments online and here as well who are looking to do similar things, or they're already progressing in embedding and adopting the standard, which is great. So before we get to the last mentee question, if there's any questions that people ask about where do I learn more about the standard. So if you aren't aware, it's available on gov.uk, and the URL is at the bottom of the slide there. It's in government trial, so we have released this previously internally as a beta test. Now we're releasing it open to the professions and publicly, and we do welcome any feedback. This is an evolving standard. We want to make sure that we move along as things progress on practices, and so we can incorporate that for government. So if there are any points that you'd like to raise, then please feel free to send us some information at that email address. For those in government, please contact your departmental head of profession for project delivery. They have been very engaged in this process. They will be able to provide you some further information, or also point you to some people who can provide some further advice. And lastly, as we had seen at the start when Tony had mentioned we are one of 15 functional standards, then we are aiming, or government is aiming, for those standards to be released around, I would say by mid-2019. I think we'll put that as a line in the sand there. And I'll pass it back to Merv for the last mentee question.
Challenges, that's interesting. 339 challenges, so this isn't going to be easy. But let's go on to the last question, which is what we want to know is what you've learned, or what will you do differently as a result of this webinar. So, and we think this is really important. We're really keen on reflective practice. We want to know what you think, and I often talk about event ROI. And I think the event ROI typically comes about through essentially changes in behavior. So what will you do differently as a result of attending this webinar? And because we're doing it in the moment, then you know, you have the opportunity to reflect straight away. Remember, we can all see your answers, so we'll be delighted if you're able to keep them positive. So so I think we'll continue to run that, and as I say, you'll be able to look at those. Apologies we don't get to the questions today, but maybe we can actually look at those and do some sort of FAQs. So I kind of guessed that we'd see something about this, and it's saying, well, the standard is not appropriate to agile approaches, is it? So how does it deal with agile?
I always have great fun with this one. Tony's already said it's agnostic to the style. The trouble is when people ask this question, they're normally coming from the context they're working in. They're often working in a software development, agile can be wider than that. And in terms of project, when we looked at it in the context of this delivery standard, it would be much more. There's obviously the hardware, the environment, the training, the business processes, the embedding, and God knows what else going on. So agile is one method that can be used in, and quite often people talk about hybrid now, don't they? All that means is there's lots of methods going on. No, agile is the only particular method that has a name in the standard. It's totally inclusive. How you deliver your specialist deliverables has to be appropriate to what those deliverables are and proportionate. And so if it's appropriate, you use it. If it isn't, you don't. If you look through the standard, you'll find lots of places where it says, you know, requirements may evolve whilst the design is going on. Development might evolve whilst the design is going on. And so there's lots of hints here that hint at well, actually the agile works here as well. Because there's not one agile, there's many, many different forms of it. And you'll find scattered through lots of things like this. Continuous integration, which you mentioned. It's all possible. The only thing is, choose the appropriate one, define how you're going to do it and do it.
So, you know, I understand this question has been asked a lot as we've gone through this, and we said very loudly we need to make sure that this will cater just as well for agile approaches as well as other kinds of approaches, because we can do a lot of that in the Home Office. What's been really interesting in doing the kind of next level down, because then we do go into the different methodologies and at what point you apply different things, it works fine, is what we're finding. It works absolutely fine. So I think, you know, for me, the proof is in the pudding, and I'm really keen as we kind of develop this that we kind of demonstrate and use it. And if we need to do some tweaking to the standard, you know, this is something that I'm sure we will do over time. But I think at the moment it's coming out quite nicely.
Great. It's not prescriptive. Like the digital when that comes out, you'll see it is prescriptive about where to use agile techniques, but ours is sort of overreaching.
Okay, perhaps two questions to close really. So one, and this came through in a number of forms. Will suppliers be expected to use or adopt the standard, for example, in bid management?
I think that we would expect, you know, we're making this public, we would expect our suppliers to be cognizant of it, and so that they can, you know, fit their bids into the overall structure. You know, it will have varying degrees of impact, but we would certainly expect our suppliers to be aware of the kind of management system that we're using to run big projects that they're engaged in the same way that we would expect them to adopt certain health and safety standards, for example.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Tony. And yes, this is widely available, and we'd expect to see lots of downloads happening even now. So thank you for that. Maybe one question to close, and I think this probably came from quite a number of civil servants, and it was, do I need to start being compliant with the standard?
I wanted to say something about this anyway. The word compliant makes me incredibly uncomfortable. I think that I've done a lot of, in different places in companies, developing and rolling out standards, and things can go very badly wrong if you get into this language and behavior of compliance and you know, becoming a policeman here. So this is these standards are designed as empowering tools to help people understand how we do things around here, what can be done. They are not designed as straitjackets. Of course, when we go out and do assurance on a project, we'll be looking and saying, well, you know, is this what you're doing? Is that sort of broadly in line with what we're talking about? But we're not going to be into a sort of, process of compliance management, which ends up being bureaucratic. I have seen that happen. It requires a lot of expertise, actually, and sophistication to know how to apply a standard in a, as Robert keeps saying, proportionate manner. It's designed to help and improve. It's not designed as a stick to beat people around the head with.
Okay, well, thanks ever so much. So this webinar that was billed as an introduction to the project delivery standard, hopefully we've done that, and hopefully then beyond the introduction there will be significant effort in rolling it out and actually driving through the implementation. And I think Jay and I talked about embedding earlier. So that pretty much brings things to an end. What we want to do is to thank Tony, Robert, Fiona and Jay for speaking, and our panelists. Thank you for all those that joined us. I know there was quite a cross-section of people that have joined us and made this a success, in particular in responding through the Mentimeter. Do download that handout about our series. There will be more webinars, but with that, thank you very much.